there's plenty of controversial stuff in the plan, but it's where we thought we could add value the most. And finally, look, the issue that you raised about unbundling, lots has been written about it. What I think a lot of the commentary misses is that the countries that require unbundling, first of all, a lot of that was of the existing telco line. You could, to a certain extent, we did that too with narrowband. As we shifted to the broadband world, we changed. And it was a very, we could go through the history of 1998 through 2003, and you could interpret it in a lot of different ways. But the point is, here we are in 2010. What are you going to do now? The unbundling rules that are enforced in a lot of other countries are often enforced in countries where there's where most of the broadband, 70% of broadband, is bought by consumers from on a facility owned by the incumbent telco. And cable has relatively small market share. The U.S., cable is the majority market share. I don't think there's anywhere where cable is unbundled. And so if you adopt the other countries' rules, you would end up unbundling the number 2. And I mean, it's just all it's just really different. And cable's about to extend its lead in terms of performance with DOCSIS 3.
Right.
So it wasn't, so some of the analysis that came in and said, just do what France didn't take into account that France is very different. By the way, another reason why France is different is for reasons that are complicated. A lot of their triple play offerings that people compare the prices to have very few channels, whereas, I mean, order of magnitude 30 to 40 channels compared to the 200 that we get. So it's the apples to oranges problem is very significant.
Understood. You also mentioned briefly the fact that you see some federal visibility into moving the national telecom network from circuit switch to IP and I guess packet.
Yeah.
Obviously, that kind of a priori makes sense because we're moving from a voice to a data network.
Right.
What is your thinking on how that can be accomplished and what the government role can be in that process?
Well, again, this is a plan. It's not a proceeding.
Right.
Well, one of the things that's just very striking is you look at some number of years, and we all know that there will be a moment in time where it no longer makes sense for anyone to spend money on the circuit switch network. But right now, due to a variety of federal and state rules, carriers of last resort and others continue to invest in those networks. Plus we have 911 facilities. We have a number of different things that really go to public policy that ride over that voice circuit switch network. What we said in the report, and I think it's one of those things that I think is profoundly important, and I congratulate you on noticing because a lot of people miss this. Unlike the digital television transition, and unlike the switch from analog to digital mobile phones, perhaps the government is more limited in what it needs to do. But as was also true of those two things, there are some significant public policy concerns, and government ought to be conscious. We shouldn't just wait until the crisis hits and suddenly there's no reason to invest in these things, particularly when we have rules that require investment. So we want to be we want to be thoughtful about the process. It's not going to happen tomorrow. It's not going to happen next year. It's not going to happen in 2015. But there'll be a moment in time, and I don't know where it is, that there really needs to be a switchover, as there was in those other transitions. And what we said is that the government ought to start a proceeding to try to examine it so it has a good handle on what all the issues are and can be conscious about it. One of the things I said at the meeting where I presented this, and when I was a freshman in college, I heard a Benedictine monk named Donald Nichols say that crises were brought about by the failure to work in the interstices, a word that I did not know what the meaning of it was when I heard it, but looked it up, and it means between things. And being in Washington a while, we do seem to, as a country, stumble from crisis to crisis. And part of my own personal hope for this plan was that we could identify crises ahead of time and actually, in some way, work between the interstices to prevent those crises from happening. Another story from my earlier time at the FCC, One of the things that may turn out to be one of the most important things we did, though no one recognizes it, which is perfectly fine, is that when I arrived at the FCC, the digital television plan, which was then called the High Definition Transition Plan, was supposed to go for 30 years, and 30 years plus. At a minimum, was supposed to, at the earliest it would end would be 2023. Okay, we fought very hard with the broadcasters to have a 10-year transition. Turned out to be 12 years. That's okay. The point is, the spectrum over which Americans in the next few years will start to enjoy the 4G LTE service is spectrum that was cleared up by that transition. Had we not done that, even though we didn't know it would be used for that, but had we not done that, this country would be having a crisis relative to other countries which have freed up more spectrum. So in the same way, we want to use this plan to try to avoid some crises, and we shouldn't have a crisis about the end of the public switch network. We should be thoughtful about it. It's going to happen.
Yeah, and we'll see about wireless
we'll see.
And broadband data and how far it goes.
Right,
It's not a fait accompli at this point.
No, clearly it's not going to be sufficient for a lot of institutional uses. Whether it's sufficient for the mass market, that's what makes baseball. It's great. You never know who wins the game until you play it.
And lastly, the plan, like any good plan, sets out some checkpoints for the short term and the middle term and the long term.
Right.
What, in your mind, are some critical elements of that? So when we come out of this thing, America will have reached the broadband future that it requires.
Yeah. In Chapter 2 of the plan, we set out 6 different metrics that we think are important to measure us by. And I think those are valuable, and they came out of our evaluation of where the trends were going and things like that. But at the end of the day, I think the most important thing to remember is that government cannot guarantee that any of those things be accomplished. Government is a player. It controls certain key inputs. It ought to do so better. But the real question, there are lots of other variables that government does not control, should not control, about whether we reach those things. So what we tried to do in the plan was make sure we were utilizing the levers of government as effectively as possible in a way that would move toward those goals. But that doesn't guarantee we get to the goals. That's really up to the creativity and imagination of lots of different Americans.
Blair Levin, thank you very much.
Thank you very much,
We
David.
really
Good to see
appreciate
you.
it.